everybody, and welcome to Terf Talk Down Under. My name's Angie, and I've got Dr. Jon Ulher with us today, and we will be talking about the Greens and some of the characters that the Greens have been platforming recently. Now, Jon, would you like to tell us a little bit about your background?
I'd be happy to, and the last name is Uhler, but I respond. Don't worry, I respond to anything. Angie, I appreciate you having me on. My background, I've been doing therapy here in the States for about 30 years, so I'm speaking to you from South Carolina, originally from California, but I've been doing therapy for about 30 years, worked in all sorts of settings, but have kind of three primary specialties. One is dealing with sexual abuse survivors, really some of the more severe kind of cases. Kids in the system, what they call, at least out here, multiple placement failures. So group homes, you go through the foster care system, and then if a kid can't adjust or be contained, they'll go to a group home and then a residential setting where they have a school and then living situations on ground. And then I was recruited by the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections back in 2005 to start what would be in the US, the nation's first intensive treatment program for men in long-term solitary confinement, really the worst of the worst. Pennsylvania, I think, is the fourth or the fifth largest prison system as far as state system. It's one of the oldest here in the US. And they had a challenge because no psychology staff wanted to deal with that population. So they were, a number of them kind of almost threatened to go on strike. So the system had to hire from outside of itself. And I finally said yes. I said no a couple of times because my clients ended up being the Hannibal Lecter kind, the pillagers, the rapists, the people that have hacked up body parts and those kind of things. Did that for 6 solid years, and through that I accrued more clinical contact hours than any prison psychology staff in the US or Canada, probably the world, quite frankly. I'm not published, but I know that to be true. And as far as publishing, at some point in time, I have a number of websites, which I'll reference in a moment. But after working in the solitary confinement unit for 6 solid years, I then headed up one of the state's high-intensity, standalone 65-bed unit forensic treatment program for sexually violent predators. Then the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections flew Dr. Robert Hare out from British Columbia to train a few of us that were hand-selected in the Hare psychopathy checklist, so the PCLR. So I'm certified in that. Then did a lot of additional groups, including low and high intensity treatment, sex offender treatment groups in prison. I also headed up the institution's mental health unit as far as the special needs unit. After 11 years, I retired and I started one website and then another. The first one was churchprotect.org. It still is in existence. That's my training site. Has a lot of my clinical work on that one. So churchprotect.org. And then I started another website called SurvivorSupport.net. There's no space or underscore, it's just SurvivorSupport.net. I have a blog, SurvivorSupport.us. I do a Friday night counseling program live on internet TV. That's Eastern Standard Time, called Journey to Healing. That one's fun because I get to just deal with counseling issues. And have started a new website and podcast called Unmasking the Transmovement.com. So that is, we're very excited about that because it is an opportunity to provide a platform for a lot of good people that have a lot of serious concerns about what I consider to be the world's greatest man-made scheme, scam, and ruse that is targeting the most vulnerable among us. And it is an active threat to women and children. And it is a heyday. It's a dream come true for financial and sexual predators. And so that would be the trans movement. And that's what we're here to talk about today, as you indicated.
Yes. Well, that's where you came to my attention with your work. You being so outspoken about the trans movement, because here in Australia, many therapists have been silenced by their regulatory boards. And although privately they will say they have huge reservations about this, although the College of Psychiatrists has actually come out and said, urged there to be more nuance in the debate around transgenderism and to be more holistic treatment, not to be affirmation. The psychologists, who are the people who primarily deal with kids and primarily are asked to speak publicly on the issue of transgenderism, their board is completely captured. And with the conversion bills now coming in, that's really impacted how children are funneled into the affirmation-only gender clinics, because previously a child would present with gender issues to a psychologist or to a doctor, even to a GP, before they even got to the psychologist, and then they would be assessed over a period of sessions. Now what we find is happening is children are presenting to either GPs or their first visit with a psychologist. And if gender is the primary issue, they are immediately referred to a gender clinic and then shoved down the affirmation process. So yeah, it's been a really scary time to be a therapist in Australia. We're really hoping that more and more of them speak up. So then the organisations that are representing them, which appear to have been bought by these inclusivity practices, will be more likely to support their members rather than an ideology. And do you find the same in the US, that the organisations for therapists are captured?
We are probably behind you. I think Australia and then Canada. Canada has become very much almost totalitarian with this issue, but the US is far behind. I think there's some pushback. If I can, in a nutshell, maybe share with your viewers how they can best understand this. Because I think once somebody understands what this really is, then the sentiment shifts to what I consider to be a high bar approach to child protection. What we're dealing with the trans movement, as I seek to educate people, as a therapist that's been in the field for 30 years, I have a little perspective. Now I'm leveraging that to help people see that the first thing they need to understand about the trans movement is it doesn't exist. Now, of course, right? We wouldn't be talking about it if it didn't exist. But what I want people to at least contemplate is that there's been the most aggressive and strategically effective marketing campaign that has ever been launched. So that come the year 2023, which we all are in, certain things have come to be accepted without thoughtful or critical analysis. So what I want parents, what I want educators, what I want all good people to think through is the possibility that what we have been told and the language that has been used, and now what's become commonly accepted and now codified, is a grand ruse. And I'll tell you how I can say that. So people really need to understand this, because I'm not anti anybody. I'm anti certain things, such as predation of kids. I am for, I'm not anti, I am for the protection of women and children. And anything that would make them vulnerable, really anybody vulnerable. I want people to understand that prior to the year 2005, so we're going back a few years now, almost 20 years, huh? Okay. So prior to 2005, there was no such thing as trans anything.
Mm.
It didn't exist. Just didn't exist. How can I say that? Well, because I had an adolescent female group home dealing with the most severe cases.
Yep.
A step down, step up, step down from a psych hospital. If you want to find out anything true about peer culture, youth peer culture, and about yourself or anything, you work with severely emotionally disturbed, multiple placement failure kids, because they have no filter and they have no fear. So you're going to find out what is true, what's going on in the world, what's going on in youth culture. Never once. I graduated with a master's degree in 1992. So from 1992 to 2005, myself and my colleagues experienced zero trans anything.
Wow.
All the college textbooks, the graduate college textbooks, zero reference to trans. All the major theorists, all of my college professors, all the esteemed lecturers that we had at Cal State Fullerton, not one reference to trans, because it didn't exist. Because it's not real. There's no trans kid, there's no trans person. I'll tell you what there is. There are people, there are kids that are confused.
Yep.
And that are wounded. And that are ripe to be manipulated by those who have other designs for those kids rather than their best interest. It used to be in the field of psychology that we were all about the business of self-esteem. We wanted to help improve self-esteem. Well, the way you did that was help, especially a young person or anybody, but help a young person understand the issue of their uniqueness and that they are wonderful as they are, and you build their competencies. You help them find what they're good at.
Yeah.
And they will start to improve. They'll start to get better. They'll start to grow. The trans movement comes along, and the premise is you will only get better to the extent that you eradicate yourself. Even so much so that the person you were born as, you have to so separate yourself and discard and chop up into pieces that we're going to call that part of you a dead name.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, therefore, you're saying the core person doesn't exist anymore.
Mm-hmm.
That's horrible. And that's why a kid, a child, a young person will never get better in the trans deception, because you're telling them that they can be born in the wrong body.
Mm-hmm.
Really? So XX and XY chromosomes don't mean what they mean. We used to have a phrase, I would imagine all over the world, but at least in the US, a little phrase called Biology 101, referencing an entry-level college course.
Mm-hmm.
So that phrase would be sort of euphemistic to like, well, it's self-evident. Well, that's Biology 101, you know. Well, why did we used to say that phrase? Well, because in Biology 101, you deal with chromosomes, you deal with male and female, which is the most basic of all things. Manipulators, predators, perpetrators, cult leaders know that they have one primary task in order to begin to capture the minds, the emotions, and the hearts, the affections, and the loyalties of someone, meaning you've captured them. You've captured them as far as they're going to be a part of your new family. They're going to be a part of the community. Anybody familiar with cults? This makes sense, right? You recruit and you retain. How do you recruit a child, a young person? It's usually teenagers that get recruited into cults. You employ and implement classic time-tested techniques. One of the first things you employ is you have to separate that young person from their family. you divide and conquer. And so you will start to create within the child, within the young person, within the teenager, a sense that their parents don't understand.
Mm.
And then that their parents really don't have their best interest in mind, and that their parents are actually trying to hold them back or do something that is detrimental. But these people, they truly have the kid's best interest in mind. So they're drawing the child away. And so the cult, as they bring that child in, that cult has to limit contact. They create a world within a world that limits, just like totalitarian governments, by the way, limits the free flow of information so that the inductee can no longer think for themselves. They give their loyalty and their allegiance and their will, basically, into the hands of the top-down structure of the cult and the feel or the milieu, or what we might also even say the ideology of this group. So I have to make sure, if I'm a cult leader, that you as the parent, you're not going to have access to your child anymore. So I'm going to do it a couple different ways. Either I snatch your child and take him out to the boonies, or I create a whole lot of fear and disincentive and subtle or not so subtle, covert or overt threats that are going to serve as barriers, boundaries, and speed bumps from you coming and trying to win your child back. So I have now captured the mind of your child. We used to call it brainwashing. I now call it mental and emotional manipulation. So once I have your child, so I'm manipulating this child, this teen. Once I have them, I refer to them also as mine. We're the family now. They're part of our community. If anybody tries to come along and, as it were, bring that child back out of that very detrimental situation, which is only benefiting those at the higher levels, it's really a pyramid scheme. So that young person now has skin in the game. So that should ring a bell with the trans movement. So if anybody tries to now pry my fingers off of my child, as the cult will say, or remove them or get them back out to really be debriefed, I will say, you are converting my child, our community member. You are pulling them away, you're converting. And so I will then make sure you can't convert my child. So I might even call it, what you're doing is you're employing conversion therapy. They flip the language. They're masters of manipulation with the language. Cults, manipulators, and sophisticated predators all know how to toy with language, and they use euphemistic terms, and they will not use exact terms. So instead of, for instance, being accurate with certain medical terminology, what we might call a double mastectomy, they will call top surgery. Instead of calling it an oophorectomy or castration for boys, oophorectomy for young ladies, they'll say bottom surgery. Well, so much for the ability to have informed consent, because if you toy with the language, the reality and the meaning and the implications of what that child, what that young person, what that minor is heading toward, because that's the best way to understand the trans movement. The trans movement is, people need to understand, the best way to view it is a conveyor belt or a moving sidewalk. I can guarantee you this, that if a young person progressively, if they move into the trans movement, if they start speaking in terms of non-binary pronouns, they're already being mentally manipulated onto this moving sidewalk. The next level is, we're going to start transitioning in terms of social transitioning. We're heading somewhere. Now they're going to also say that they're no longer identifying with their genes. So they're no longer a girl, they want to be a boy. They're no longer a boy, they want to be a girl. So we continue down the path. Now they're going to transition more and more, and eventually they're going to be taken to a doctor. And the doctor is going to put them, depending upon age, they're going to start them with Puberty blockers. Well, puberty blockers will sterilize that child. There's no debate. So let that sink in. You've now ended the family tree. You've sterilized this child. It shouldn't surprise any of us. Margaret Sanger, head of Planned Parenthood, was an avowed eugenicist.
Yep.
Okay. The number one player in the space, so to speak, of transgender medicine now, pretty much, at least in the US, is Planned Parenthood. Interesting.
Yeah.
You've sterilized these kids. Okay, that's just the beginning. So they socially transition, then they medically, and then after being sterilized, that sidewalk, that moving sidewalk, that conveyor belt is going to dump them out onto a surgeon's gurney where they will be amputated. Their sex organs will be amputated. And then they will be a customer of Big Pharma for life. That
Any
is the
parent,
trans movement.
yeah, any parent knows that it's a natural part of a child's development for them to, mildly rebel, to test boundaries, between, as puberty comes along, the tween to teen age. It's a time for most kids to, separate further from their parents and attach themselves to a peer group. Now, this ideology swoops in at that vulnerable time and kidnaps our children. Basically, that's how I see it.
Okay.
I was listening to a podcast the other day, and they were talking about the social conditions where, because of, say, COVID, because of the nature of the internet, bringing war and famine and doom and gloom into our world. In a way that historically hasn't happened before, that children are more likely to develop, particularly those who spend too much time online or who have, other things in their family background that make them vulnerable, that the social condition of the world being full of doom and gloom has almost traumatized children. So they're more likely to be seeking something. And in the absence of, say, social activities, because I remember when we were kids, we'd finish school and you wouldn't see us until dark. That doesn't happen anymore. People live more separated lives. And in the absence of faith as well, then kids are sort of looking for something in a world that they find scary, particularly as approaching puberty or approaching adulthood. Pornography is coming into our homes at younger and younger rates. And that is absolutely terrifying, not just for girls either, but for little boys. And so, the external forces are ripe to get these kids into a place of vulnerability where their parents, are trying to nurture them through it, as all parents do, but with boundaries and things like that. And then this cult comes in and steals our kid and tells the one person, one people that can save them from this, the parents and the family and the teachers that are meant to be close to them, then it sort of whisks them out instead of, allowing them to go through this normal phase of development where they realize that the world is actually safe. It's created, a culture of kids who feel frightened. And they are primed. They're primed for the picking. Right. What do you think?
Yeah, let me add a couple of additional pieces that I think will help provide the context then for what's really germane then for our discussion, which is predators that are using the trans movement. The predators will use anything. My greatest concern are churches, quite frankly. But they're going to use any way they can get access to kids. The next to churches, the greatest source of gaining access to vulnerable kids that I know of is the trans movement.
Yeah.
So if I'm a predator, I'll tell you where I'm going first. I'm going to go to churches. Next, I'm going into the trans movement. And that's part and parcel, and I'm going to make my way into schools. And then from there, I'll make my way into all sorts of professions that are mandated reporters, because they have regular and consistent access to kids. One of the things that the trans movement has done, by the way, is they have taken, or it has taken, and they've done so very adeptly, the pushers of this. And I consider the trans movement to be 80%, so about 85%, to be those that are being used, and about 20% those that are strategically pushing, and they will be predatory, either financial predators or sexual predators.
Yeah.
So the smaller group, it's really multi-level marketing, sort of. The top of the pyramid scheme are those that stand to benefit from very slick marketing and mental and emotional manipulation. The thing that should raise huge concerns is that every mandated reporter, and think about how many fields, professional fields that entails, mental health, physicians, so all of medicine, psychiatry, education, sports, any clergy, at least here in the States, anybody that has regular, meaningful, and significant contact with a child is a mandated reporter. Here in the States, a mandated reporter is required to renew their certification every 2 years. So it's an ongoing, especially somebody that's licensed. So somebody, I just completed mine again, every 2 years, literally finished up today.
Cool.
Okay. So it's an ongoing thing to have to be trained in the identification of what is potential as far as the red flags of abuse. And there's a number of different kinds of abuse. You have mental, emotional, physical, but you have sexual abuse. The trans movement, the pushers of the trans movement come along, and they now have caused mandated reporters to reframe in their minds the 9 key red flag clinical indicators of sexual abuse.
Yeah.
They've reframed that in terms of gender issues, which means now we that are on the front lines of protecting kids, we've been dumbed down.
Yeah.
That therefore, the primary, I'll give a couple of very quick examples. The number one thing for any mandated reporter that should set off fire alarm bells in their mind is if you have a young person, let's say a middle school, junior high, a kid that's in grade 6 or 7 or 8, we're certainly into high school, let's say grade 7 or grade 8. They sit down in front of you and they say, let's say a girl, she sits down and she says, I hate being a girl, I wish I was a boy. Any properly trained professional, including teacher, any mandated reporter, I'll tell you the very first thing that should go through their mind, this kid's being perped on.
Yep.
Because the girl is reasoning to herself, being a victim, if I wasn't a girl, he wouldn't continue to do that to me.
Yep.
Okay. Do you really think any young person is going to walk up to you and say, hey, I'm being sexually perpetrated upon?
No.
Doesn't happen, right? You've got all sorts of shame, you have shock, they're confused, they might even be threatened. So they're going to drop hints if they're willing to talk about it. But you're also going to see behavioral changes. See if this rings a bell. You're going to see depression. You're going to see anxiety. You're going to see behavioral changes. You're going to see eating disorders. You're going to see fluctuation of emotions throughout the day. We might even call that borderline personality disorder. We might call it bipolar.
Yeah.
We're also going to see self-injurious behavior, cutting on oneself. We're going to see panic attacks. We're going to see confusion with gender. We're going to see possibly very sexualized behavior.
Yeah.
But haven't I just described everything that a gender therapist would see a child and say, oh, well, it seems to me like I think you're trans. And off they go. For what? we're going to medicalize them, and then we're going to slice off her breasts, without that person even knowing that the part of them, that wounded child, that wounded teen, might be in a dissociative state because of sexual trauma. And there may be, as it were, a male part of that young person, that girl, who suddenly looks around saying, I don't identify with this. What are these? Get these off of me. And because the doctor wants to make money, it's not hard to figure out why a child, whether or not a child really understands the implications of what they're doing. It doesn't hurt anybody till they're 18. And so I'm then going to, instead of begin to really try to figure out what's going on with this young person, especially if I see all sorts of self-injurious scars all over their body, I'm going to stop. If I care about this child, I'm going to figure out what's happened with this child. I'm not going to fast track them to get a double mastectomy so I can make $40,000 or more in a few hours so I can buy another yacht. Okay, that's a huge concern. Why? Because my contention is this: there are people waiting in the wings and people that are within the trans activists that are predatory.
Yes.
And because we've drunk the Kool-Aid, we can't spot. And so my challenge to people is, if a child predator was in your midst, would you know the warning signs? I know them professionally. And I can tell you, there are many predators that are activists in the trans movement that have designs for your child. And if you encourage them into the trans movement, you are welcoming them into the arms of those that will say, love is love, love knows no boundaries, love knows no age, love knows no limits. And you've just done what with that child? That should concern us all. One other thing that a parent needs to understand about the trans movement is this: it didn't exist prior to 2005. If you look at and do a simple internet search for the referral rates to transgender clinics, to transgender medicine, okay, there's rates that you can see both in North America, in Europe, in Australia, France, England, Tavistock. And you're going to see this, that it is flatlined up until about 2008, meaning zero referrals. Until about 2008, then there's a little blip, a couple. Then it dips back down. 2009, there's a little blip. And I have charts that people can see in my blog. They go to SurvivorSupport.net. I simply added a bunch of charts. And I superimposed some interesting data points. So when you start to look at these stats, a fad or a trend gradually moves upward like a foothill.
Yep.
Kind of starts to, right? It's just kind of gonna go up a little bit. It doesn't have an arc like a tidal wave or a tsunami. The only thing that has that is either a tsunami, okay, or a plague, a worldwide plague, or a tremendously successful marketing campaign. 2009 was the launch of RuPaul Drag Race.
Yeah.
And then it drops a little bit. And then in 2013, so 4 years later, you suddenly see it goes from flatlining to all of a sudden, and look it up, every single one. Whatever stat you want to look at as far as country, it's a little tiny blip and then it goes up. Every single one of them, it is in the year 2013. All around the world, to these gender clinics, just shoots up 2013. And I ask people this: okay, this isn't regionally, right? If it's all around the world, so, what was unleashed in 2013 that had the same effect in the US, in Canada, in England, in France, in Germany, in Australia, in New Zealand, everywhere. The publishing of the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, 5th edition, where they made a little tiny change. And that little tiny change shifted the focus, or it opened the criteria from child to now adolescent gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria. And suddenly it all became profitable.
Wow.
So there were 13 people, Zucker and Blanchard, and I've said it publicly, if they have any ethics, they will step forward publicly and say this: you know what? Everything was fine in the 2004 edition. I concur. We didn't anticipate what our work would have done, us 13 people, and we think we've created a problem. So we're going to retract everything back to the DSM-4. Trust me, I started practicing with DSM-3.
Yeah.
It's fine. Okay. If you put things back with the DSM, back to the DSM-4, as far as the diagnostic criteria, and then you remove porn, its influence in those that push it. So without the DSM-5 and without porn, the trans movement fades away back to the numbers we saw in 2005. It doesn't exist. So this is man-made in terms of the influence. So without the DSM-5, nobody could get rich off of this. And without pornography, you couldn't groom kids, meaning you couldn't override their intuition and you couldn't sexualize them, setting them up for to be preyed upon by sexual predators. So by the time a kid goes into the trans movement, they're being manipulated by those that have financial profit motive in the medical and big pharma industries, and sexual predators. And sexual predators, that's another way of saying pedophiles, quite frankly.
Yep.
And they are driven to override the boundaries of very confused kids. And the kids that comprise the trans movement, by the way, are about 80 to 85%. I saw a study that said 85%, but I think probably about 80% at least of the kids in the trans movement, the legitimate ones, meaning the wounded ones, emotionally wounded, have been sexually traumatized. You then have kids on the autism spectrum. What do those two have in common? They have a difficult time, both populations have a difficult time trusting their intuition. They are easily manipulated. You then have the social contagion, and then you have those that are actively being groomed and manipulated. That comprises the trans movement in and of itself, those kids that are being used.
So why have our governments and all of our mental health services and all of our psychiatrists and psychologists just allow them to walk right in? Is it just money?
I think it's both financial and sexual predators. I'll reference two wonderful women that have done tremendous research in this area to research how much money there is that's involved in the trans deception, trans movement. Jennifer Billick in the 11th Hour blog. Nobody's done it better as far as the research. I have learned a ton how much money is involved. According to her figures, worldwide, this is a multi-trillion-dollar industry. Big money. So you have those that, including big pharma, including even plastic surgeons, who both not just slicing off breasts, but then even the reconstruction, because now the detransitioners. There's massive, and plus, this is, you're going to consign a young person to be a customer of big pharma forever. When have we ever heard of this? Starting in the late teens. Forever. What are those drugs going to do to these kids? They're already starting to show. I mean, osteoporosis. We've got just horrific things going on, including the possibility of brain tumors. I mean, there's many, many things that are happening with these cross-sex hormones. So,
dementia.
Right? So there's a financial interest. Dr. Gallagher out of Miami, Florida, she already has a yacht. She has a penthouse. It's sick. And she calls it, she jokes about this. She says, oh, we're going to yeet the teats. Meaning we're going to slice off the breasts. These are Nazi-like doctors. So you have financial interests, and then the area that I know best are you have the predators, really the pedophiles, who are using the trans movement as an end run around age of consent laws. Somebody that's done a wonderful job in connecting the dots as far as the degree of deviance as well as porn is Genevieve Gluck.
Yes.
Yes. Of Redux. So I highly recommend Redux, because what Genevieve has done is she has looked at the people, really the deviant men, in what she finally uncovered, so what's called the eunuch archives. These are extremely porn-fueled, sexually deviant men, which are, quite frankly, white-collar sexual psychopaths, who are driven to mar and scar and have a negative effect, who have gotten into heinous stuff, including the mutilation of kids, and then you also have in their bestiality, which really furries is a part of, and then snuff porn. Okay, she has connected the influence of these very deviant men now having direct access and influence to WPATH, the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, and impacting the DSM, influencing that. And then you have money coming from those that have a lot of money that are pushing, like the Pritzkers, that are pushing this, they're the trans activists. So you have an influence with special interests that are affecting and swaying the field of psychology and psychiatry, and then medicine. And so people need to understand that those two special interests have really captured what now is the DSM, and also going to influence the ICD. So those are the manuals that have all the disorders that have the billing codes. So if you can capture the medical industry, if you can capture psychology, then eventually with the research, you'll be able to influence legislation. And why do you want that? Because if you are someone that's making a boatload of money and getting your hands on kids, if you want your hands on kids sexually, you're going to force this down people's throats. So you're going to get legislation rammed through real fast.
Our public health system has collapsed financially. Ambulances don't turn up. You can't get a bed in a public hospital. People are dying. And it's no coincidence, as far as I'm concerned, that this injection into the government's health budget has come at the same time as our system has collapsed. So in their financial interests to prioritise trans healthcare over all the other healthcare. Even during COVID, cancer treatment was postponed when we were in lockdown, even the most urgent cancer treatment. But I know personally a girl who was flown out of our state interstate to have both her breasts removed at the age of 15, wasn't required to isolate, wasn't required to do any of those things. So people were actually dying of cancer, and yet this girl got to go and have a double mastectomy a month past her 15th birthday in a private hospital, but as a patient of the public service. So as a patient of the public gender clinic. That was an eye-opener for me, because this girl got such preferential treatment and nobody talked about it. The actual hospital that organised her treatment is still lying about 15-year-olds even having double mastectomies.
Yeah, and I want people to understand, what is transgender care. First of all, it's a misnomer. Transgender care, because there's no trans anything. There are people. right? There are boys and girls, males and females that are gender confused. Okay. Trans, I like the way Jennifer Billick puts it. That's a marketing term. Okay, there's no trans anything. You don't have a third species called a trans. These are just people that bleed when you cut them. These are people that have been manipulated, that are emotionally wounded and confused. So you have men, women, boys, and girls. Transgender medicine is simply a ruse for, I'm going to take your young person, I'm going to take your minor, and I'm going to put them on puberty blockers and or cross-sex hormones. So I'm now causing them to become dependent upon big pharma, and eventually I'm going to chop their breasts off, and I'm going to give them a complete hysterectomy and oophorectomy, and I'm going to castrate them if they're a boy. That, and then I'm going to keep them on, I've got to make sure their bodies don't try to heal itself in the from that unnatural state. So you are maintaining their bodies in an unnatural state that if they stop taking these pharmaceuticals will revert back to its natural state. And these young boys that now have a fake vagina drilled into them, that gaping wound, if they don't continue to dilate that, meaning they are inhibiting the healing process of their male body. And why are they keeping it open? For some predator that's going to use them, or some guy that's going to have sex with them. So that means what's going into that open wound? This is consigning kids to adding injury to insult, trauma upon trauma. And I just saw a study and said that the suicide rate for women after going through surgery for the transgender ruse, 10 to 20 years later, is 40 times the normal population rate. Why? I call it buyer's remorse. You now already took a troubled person, and now you have really scarred them for the rest of their life and consigned them to this emotional no man's land, or no person's land. And so their life has genuinely been destroyed. We didn't even talk about how then they're going to make a fake penis out of a skin graft from either their forearm or their thighs. And they, so many of them are reporting that they don't have use anymore of their arm. And the penis doesn't work because it's a fake thing. And then for purposes of the reason why we're talking is now you take these men who can self-identify, and what the public doesn't understand is what the mindset of a sexual deviant male is. A male who has traversed downward, so descended into very predictable stages of lower and lower, or an increasing degree of perversion, to where they become inverted morally in terms of their appetites, in terms of their perspective, and their drives. They are driven not by lust. They passed that a long time ago. It starts with attraction, then lust, then they get into objectification. Part of that is lust is the beginning of objectification. Then they get into power and control. Then they're moving into eventually deviance and psychopathy. A psychopath really has three characteristics. You have a white-collar psychopath and a bloody psychopath. The essence of it is this: you have no conscience because you've overridden it. Therefore, you have no empathy and no remorse, and you are driven. So a sexual psychopath is driven by deviance, and what deviance is an intense desire, an insatiable desire, and an appetite to traumatize and have a negative effect, a negative lasting effect, by scarring and marring the soul and the mind of its intended victim. So a deviant male can only get an erection when he knows he's traumatizing his intended victim, when a normal man can't. They are no longer normal. That's why in the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections, there's a secondary level for sexually violent predators that have harmed kids from what's called the SOAB board, the Sex Offender Assessment Board. And that board, the investigators, I was invited to be an investigator or an interviewer. As part of their secondary interview process, they utilize the hair psychopathy checklist, the PCLR.
Mhm.
Why do they do that? Because if you harm a child, by nature, you're a psychopath. Because you have no conscience, you have no remorse, no empathy. So, or they want to find out to what extent anybody is a psychopath. So people need to understand then that a deviant male is not content to just be deviant by himself. That's contradictory. That would be lust-filled. And pedophiles, sexual predators, child predators are not driven by hormones and not driven by age. There's no correlation between hormones and age because it's not hormones. That's why pedophiles will use objects to insert them into children. No man is attracted to a minor. They are driven to mar and scar and traumatize that child for the rest of their life, to leave a lasting impact. Now, think in terms of the trans movement now. Think about the policies that any man who wears women's underwear and drag, and I want people to understand as a sex offender treatment provider and one that has worked with sexually deviant men for 14 plus years, no man thinks it's a reasonable supposition to wear women's underwear in this day and age unless he has saturated his mind in progressively deviant porn first.
Yeah.
Or meaning he's saturated his mind. So he's wearing women's underwear. Sam Britton from the US, that should ring a bell. He was deputy secretary, right? He's the guy that kept stealing all those bags. By the time a man is taking women's underwear, and how do people know that that man purchased underwear legally rather than acquired them from, let's say, a laundromat or off of somebody's clothesline or stealing luggage? Nobody knows that. So you don't know how dangerous this man is, because by the time he is stealing women's underwear and wearing them, he's potentially a very dangerous individual. But the more psychopathic somebody becomes, they'll either become more overtly reactive that everybody looks at and says, that's kind of an unstable person, or they will look much more normal. They'll look increasingly normal. And so where do we find them? We find them in politics, we find them in finance, we find them in law, we find them in law enforcement, we find them in psychology, in education, and medicine. We find them everywhere because they are not impulsive. They're very methodical. They're very strategic. They are very planned. They're very tactical. And they're very calculating, and they're very driven to gain access to the private spaces and private parts of children and women. Because by the time a man descends into child pornography, he first started with adult pornography. Yeah. And he then transitioned also through bestiality porn. And that's why a child predator is always busted with bestiality porn. And that should raise a lot of concerns. Parents, if you're familiar with furries and pup play, and these guys that are into leather and pup play, that's bestiality. This is grooming of kids.
So we have politicians, specifically in the Greens, which is the third most powerful party in Australia, quite often holds a balance of power in the States, things like that. We have politicians who are openly platforming furries and adult babies. We have men, one of these particularly calm psychopaths, who is 1 degree of separation from admitted pedophiles, so associates with admitted pedophiles, associates with adult babies, and associates with furries. And he is going and advising local governments on their inclusion policies, which I don't call them inclusion policies. I call them safeguarding, erasing, boundary breaking policies, right, because that is the sole purpose of these inclusion policies. Right. And we've been, trying to raise an alarm about this man, because any woman or anyone who's ever encountered this person has that feeling of this is a predator. But because he is so calm and methodical, and he goes into these agencies and seems to know exactly what he's talking about. He also is a gay man, unfortunately, because that he weaponizes his sexuality to say, well, you know, you have to listen to me because I'm a gay man. And so, you know, uses the Trojan horse that we're all familiar with, the conflation with the LGB, with the TQ plus, but he's definitely in the camp of the TQ plus. And, you know, we are watching this in real time. This man, a few men who are platformed by the Greens, are members of the Greens. The first step that they did is they got all gender critical conversation removed from their party.
That's what exactly every cult will do, right? They're going to silence the opposition. That's why they act like Nazis, right? They act like dictators. They're going to silence anybody that is going to bring up any opposing ideas.
So we tried to go around them and go to the media and say, look what they're trying to silence. Here is the evidence of this man's connection with these nefarious characters, people who are openly pedophilic, you know, and the contrast between these creeps that he hangs around with and what he's actually trying to do in his work and he's getting paid to do. And we're joining the dots, and the media's going, la, 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 we can't see anything here. Right. And yet women like myself are being targeted by the media for attempting to whistleblow this stuff. It's just, you know, and I've always said about this ideology, people don't care about it until it impacts you personally. Right. And I've been impacted personally because members of my family have transitioned. Someone I cared about when I was very young transitioned, and it took her 10 years to have all the psychological and medical processes to just okay her beginning the medical path. You know, it's affected me in so many ways, but the thing that kept me up at night was to have all my alarm bells going off that there were sexual predators, and that these sexual predators are being not only allowed into political parties, they're actively platformed by political parties. And we even have our leaders who've introduced self-ID and who promote child gender transition to the public, who are completely oblivious to what's going on. These leaders are inviting these sexual predators into the public domain. It is terrifying. It really is. Right. And we don't know what to do about it. You know, this is why I'm opening the conversation with you, you know?
I'll tell you exactly what you do with it. You speak the truth. Now you can't, so maybe you can use my voice. The reality is this: perpetrators, predators, manipulators, cult leaders, right? Those that are proficient at crossing boundaries, that have moved into the realm of psychopathy. How do you know if somebody's a psychopath? Well, you can scan their brain, but just shy of that, how do you know? There are certain telltale signs. One of the things that a manipulator, perpetrator, a sophisticated cult leader, all that, since they have moved off the straight and narrow, down the slippery slope, and the snowball has built, the snowball of selfishness, and then they layer it with whatever they're into, which is, in this case, it's pornography. By the time it morphs into psychopathy, again, only some of them will look like the kinds we all are very worried about: stranger danger, and the guy that's lurking in the parking garage that'll snatch women, throw them in a car, and we find the woman, her body is dismembered in the woods. That's very few. The majority of them will look much more normal than the average person, because they become more controlled than the average person. They are tremendously adept at impression management. And half the fun for a psychopath is putting it out there, because they're going to play good people for fools, because predators know us better than we know them, because they once had a conscience, and they know we still have one, and they don't have a conscience. There's a great deal of freedom. It's sick, but there's a great deal of freedom if you no longer have a conscience. We say, how could somebody sleep at night? Actually, they sleep very well. They need security so nobody kills them, but they actually sleep very well because nothing bothers them. One of the things that a sexual psychopath does is they put out into the public domain, they put out right in front of people what they're doing, and then they will use somebody's own conscience against them, because the perpetrator and predator knows that a normal person doesn't want to think badly about someone. They don't want to be jaded, and they don't want to cause people to think the worst of someone. We want to think the best of someone. That's a normal person. So we hesitate to call somebody what they appear, lest we're wrong, which is still a serious issue, by the way, if you call, right? But we don't want to let our minds go there, because that would not only disrupt our inner peace and our world, but we would never think about doing that. So we wouldn't want to label somebody. So they can use then that reservation, that hesitation against us by what I call the big lie theory. They will put the biggest lie out there that they can, such as pedophiles are really minor attracted, and they always have been. Okay. Or we're just playing dress up. We're just fun loving. Well, everybody's intuition is saying there's something up with this. So they will employ then two things. Again, they're going to have to get people to turn the volume down on their intuition, their reality testing mechanism within us. So we have two things to maintain boundaries: conscience and intuition. So if I'm a perpetrator, I have no conscience, and therefore the only thing to stop me from crossing your boundaries and having at you and your finances and your body and anything else that I want, if I'm not going to stop me, it better be you that's going to stop me. So it better be your intuition to maintain the boundaries. But if I can get you to lower if I get you to doubt yourself and turn the volume down on your intuition, I will easily get you to lower your boundaries. So now I have access to you. And the one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to employ a very effective method of causing you to doubt yourself, which kind of goes like this. In one way or another, I will send you the message, well, Angie, I know what it looks like, but it's really not that. And I am going to look, here it is. I'm going to look absolutely confident, so the big lie theory. And if you give me pushback, I'm going to pretend to be hurt. I'm going to pretend to be shocked. I'm going to pretend to be incredulous. I'm going to begin to act. Oh, this should sound familiar. I'm going to almost look like somebody whose spouse has busted the guy for looking at porn. How did the majority of unrepentant guys act when they're busted with porn? The wife comes around the corner. He's on the computer, and she says, "What are you doing?" He says, "What?" I saw it. No, you did. I didn't. Right. So we got abject denial, big lie there. I wasn't looking at anything. Now you watch his energy go up, and now he's going to what's called flip the script. He's going to say, "I can't. What are you doing up at night? And what are you don't trust me, and I can't believe it. And how could you even think after all that? And you're accusing me of this. See how it is? You never." And what am I doing? I'm now pushing back. I'm now playing upon your desire to give the benefit of the doubt. And so I'm going to begin to cause you to doubt yourself. I'm going to cause you to feel false guilt, which is really shame. I'm going to begin to cause you to withdraw. I'm going to cause you to pull your boundaries in. So if a wife catches her husband accessing porn, she needs to have better boundaries, not begin to put her boundaries down. So if I'm a guy and I'm wearing a diaper, what people need to understand is this: no reasonable man, or no man thinks it's a reasonable thing to wear a diaper or women's underwear unless he has accessed hundreds and hundreds of hours of progressively deviant pornography, guaranteed, no exception. What I would say is this: for any man that is pushing diaper wearing, his electronics, his online activity, his financial records, and his phone GPS should be investigated immediately by law enforcement.
Yep.
If any man wants to debate me, he can come on my live program on Friday nights, Eastern Standard Time. We'll have this debate. Because what I would say to any man is this. So this gentleman that you're referencing, I don't know him, so I have the freedom to say this. What would I say to him? I would say, first of all, interesting that you're playing good people for fools. Let's talk about how much pornography you've been accessing. As a matter of fact, I would say, sir, tell you what, while we're talking right now, will you say yes so that I can give law enforcement permission to begin to access your home electronics and online activity and financial records and phone GPS while you and I are maintaining contact right now? Are you so clean as to, can they go in right now as we're talking? You'll watch him start to sweat. No, he'll duck and he'll dodge. He'll say, well, no, I would really, well, they can go on mine right now. Let him go on both of our computers right now. Okay. He's been accessing deviant stuff. How do we know? Look at Sam Britton of the US. Look at Leah Thomas, the deviant freak guy who now has been unmasked. Why does he want to go on Penn State swim team and ruin women's sports? For access into the locker rooms and showers and seeing women naked and traumatize them. He would have been doing 5 to 10 years for what he now can, quote unquote, legally do.
I know.
So any man that dresses deviantly is accessing pornography. If they are pushing legislation, they're doing so for reasons so that they can protect themselves and shut everybody else's mouth. And if some man is dressing as an infant, I can tell you what kind of pornography he's accessing. What do you think? 100%. 14 years of working with thousands of men, both in prison and in community-based sex offender treatment, says he's accessing child pornography.
Yeah.
It's up to him to prove he's not. People need to understand these are very dangerous men, and that's why they're so aggressive about silencing people like me. Because they don't want the public to awaken to the fact that they're putting it out there, and they're going to silence anybody who would blow the whistle and unmask this grand deception and put boundaries against them from accessing the private spaces of children and women, and from raising the bar on child protection. Anybody that pushes back against a high bar approach to child protection, we should consider they're doing so for a reason.
Yeah.
This is not accidental. That man exhibits all the red flag warning signs of a sexual predator.
Yep. And well, we're actually at the end of our time, but I'm glad you brought that up, because myself and another group of women, we will not stop until this guy is taken out of that role and hopefully has his heart.
And I'll make myself, Angie, I'll make myself available to anyone in Australia, actually anyone around the world. If you want to debate me on live TV, you set that up and I'm there anytime.
Oh, excellent. I'd like to see that. I think there's a few people that pop into the comments on my Twitter that I would love to see in a debate with you, who defend all sorts of disgusting behavior and claim it to be relatively innocent, you know, furries and adult babies and all that stuff. Yeah, I would absolutely love to see that. And I'd like to see you debate some of our politicians too.
Absolutely. Yeah, let's do it on live TV.
Yeah, cool. All right. Well, I'll get all your details and I'll pop them in a link underneath this. And yeah, thank you very, very much, Jon. It's been good talking to you. I actually feel a bit more, I don't know, relaxed about trying to be a whistleblower here, because, you know, I trust my own instincts, but it's always good to have them reinforced by someone who has, like, you know, professional experience in this area. So yes, thank you so much for agreeing to talk to us. I suspect that this is going to be a bit of a ratings boon for Terf Talk Down Under. Yeah, we're a small channel, but you know, some fairly influential people get to see us here. Yeah, so if anyone wants to support our channel, like, subscribe, share. And thank you so much for joining us, Jon. It's been very, very enlightening. Thank you. Thanks for your good work.